And the question is, if in the course of your own career as journalists, over the, say, the last decade or so, you have noticed any palpable, any noticeable change in the narrative, in the way the stories from not just Palestine, Iraq, Syria, Egypt, etc., can be communicated, the vocabulary that you use, the sentences that you use, the sentiments, historical references that you use has been changed at all in your own experience. And second, as you well know, the internet now makes it possible for us to speak to a much larger audience, not only Americans. You can talk to Asia, in Africa, in Latin America. And that opens up a whole different notion of public sphere and where and how we talk. And whether or not, since you're all internet savvy, this fact that no longer your audience is limited to an American audience, is actually a global audience, including places like Gaza, that they also follow the news in this context. If you could address these two related questions, first, has the narrative, or at least the terminology, idiomaticity of the language that is being used somehow changed? Second, the opening up of this space to a larger global audience has had an effect on the way you write and think and communicate. Ronnie, please.
So for the first question, absolutely. I think the narrative, largely due to alternative styles of media, with like the electronic intifada and Mondoweiss, and then the sort of windows that some of the mainstream outlets have allowed into Palestine or Palestine issues, with allowing certain writers to write for them. I do think the language has shifted. I think that it's becoming, the narrative has changed into more of one where we use words like settler colonialism now to describe what's happening. And I'm talking about just in the American context. We use that word to talk about what's happening in Israel-Palestine. So I think that, in terms of, I think that's definitely shifting the situation, but I also think that activism is having a dramatic impact as well. I don't want to leave that out, because I think like the SJP here and the SJPs all over the country on college campuses have been, really pushing that narrative more into the mainstream as well, not just, the media outlets, and they've been doing the hard work on the ground. As for the rest of the Middle East, I don't know. I do think that there's a lot of alternative avenues for people to find different information that uses language, talking about imperialism and talking about like how, why, for example, ISIS exists, as opposed to it's just some random movement that showed up. We do see people linking it to the war in Iraq and being sort of a direct result of that. But at the same time, I don't know, I'm a little bit more pessimistic about the language and whether or not it's shifted around the rest of the Middle East. Unfortunately, it's still very Orientalist, and it's still very ignorant. And I think there's a long way to go. And I don't remember what the second question was.
You have a more global audience when you write them.
No, that's actually like, that comes in very handy as like a resource, for me at least. It's great to have a global audience, especially with a topic like Israel-Palestine, because Israel, it's the number one drone exporter in the world. So what it's doing in Palestine, it's selling its weaponry that's tested on Palestinians to other parts of the world. So it's a global issue in a lot of ways. And so I do think that there is this global audience that's sort of hungry for information about what's happening there, and they're also connecting with each other. Like when I think about Ferguson in Palestine, for example, and when Ferguson was being tear gassed after Mike Brown was murdered by Darren Wilson. And, you had Palestinians tweeting out advice to people in Ferguson on how to deal with tear gas. I mean, that's not something that could necessarily happen without the internet, right, and without Twitter. And so that kind of stuff is really inspiring, and I think it's definitely a resource for bringing movements together, movements that have a lot of intersections. In the case of Ferguson, it's, the police departments operating in St. Louis were trained, received some training in Israel, which almost every single major American police department has, which is another story the media in this country refuses to touch.
In terms of the narrative shift, I think Rania did a great job at talking about the proliferation of alternative media outlets. And these alternative media outlets really center Palestinian voices and the narrative, even if it's non-Palestinians writing about this topic and sort of trying to get this context of the Nakba that Joe mentioned out. I don't think this has shifted in terms of the mainstream. As we discussed, you would be very hard pressed to find an article on Gaza about the last war that mentioned why Palestinian refugees are in Gaza. Of course, 1948, the Nakba, and why they're not allowed to return home. That crucial context, the root of the conflict, does not get disseminated enough. And this something that I've been thinking about recently. With Netanyahu's reelection, there's been a lot of hand-wringing in the American Jewish community, which I cover quite closely. And this has been getting sort of a lot of attention in the mainstream press. Unfortunately, you don't see, and this is, I'm not saying that they shouldn't cover this. This is, I cover it. I think it's important to cover the kind of relationship and the importance of the American Jewish community in terms of consolidating the U.S.-Israel relationship, but you don't have that same type of coverage when it comes to Arab-American activism or the Palestinian diaspora in the United States. There are robust debates going on within these communities. There are important debates. There's important activism, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. Palestinians called for it in 2005, and it's kind of blooming in the U.S. and really, I think Palestinians in the diaspora that are living here are leading that. That hasn't gotten enough coverage, and I think it's from the same kind of mentality that dictates why we don't seek more coverage of the Nakba. In terms of the public sphere and sort of the global public sphere that I, as a journalist, am dealing with, I think it makes me more accountable. It makes me think more closely about how I'm writing a story, even if it's a simple news story, how I'm contextualizing it, whether I'm mentioning the right context, and also talking to the folks who are most impacted, talking to Palestinian Americans and Arab Americans and so on. So I think it makes me sort of think harder about how I'm trying to disseminate this coverage.
Thank you, Joe.
The main difference I've seen over the past decade, that's our timeline, it's an increase in accountability for what's written or published or broadcast, which I think has inevitably shifted the terms somewhat. Today, we still see the BBC or the New York Times occasionally publish or say something monumentally stupid. It's actually quite common. But at least when it happens now, there's a reasonable chance that Electronic Intifada or Mondo Weiss or someone similar will publish something exposing their error, their bias, which is likely to be read somewhat widely. I think there's a great deal of interest in this sort of media criticism. So they aren't quite as free to say anything they like without being held to account. And this has a lot to do with the broader range of media that people can choose to consume now. In terms of how the globalization of media has changed the way I write in particular, I like to think of myself as a solidarity activist writing for other solidarity activists. So I always have in mind to choose topics and cover them in such a way that they'll provide useful information about events on the ground in Gaza when I was there, or campaigns going on here, which other people involved in the same struggle elsewhere might find useful. And of course, having a global audience broadens the possibilities for that considerably.
Thank you, Hani.
Well, first of all, I'm not a journalist, so let's let that be clear. So whenever I write because I study racism and post-colonialism and settler colonialism, and I see ugly things in it that are still happening in the state of Israel. Something that happened 400 years ago in this country in a form of settler colonialism. Today, history does not repeat itself, but forms of that system is happening in Israel in its settler colonialism, and it's happening in a way a European audience, which I am more familiar with, is actually trying to whitewash it. So whenever I write, it's actually for this European audience who has a certain guilt, and it's in a way telling them that today we can talk about Zionism and we can discuss anti-Zionism without, you know, it being a sensitive issue, without it being touching upon anti-Semitism. It is not the same. And when I write, this is what I'm more of a, I like to touch upon subjects that make Europeans or Western governments, you know, hold a mirror to their face. And given that I'm from the Gaza Strip, I guess it's like carte blanche to say and write. Whenever I'm angry or mad, I get to express that. And you know, I don't want to say it's justified because it is, but no one can doubt the authenticity of it because it comes from a place that has been under siege and that has seen the most violent and hatred face of Israel.
Okay, let's open it up for questions. You could address them specifically to one of our panelists or leave it to them, please.
I think I can address that. In my personal experience, and I'm speaking as a journalist, not like an organizer, but just from what I've witnessed, I think that Israel helps us a little bit in that aspect because, like I kind of touched on it before, what Israel does in Palestine doesn't stay there. It is like an engine for repression technology because its entire being is basically, it's built around, you know, consolidating its Jewish majority, which requires, you know, enormous amount of violence against the native Palestinian population. So Israel is like this factory for repression technology. And that technology, it sort of formed this like occupation industrial complex where it's being exported around the world. And so it's being used on other marginalized populations. And you mentioned, you know, Palestine Latino solidarity. Well, at the US-Mexico border, Elbit Systems, which is Israel's largest producer of military technology, has been contracted by the Department of Homeland Security to provide surveillance technology with these, you know, to basically build this virtual wall of surveillance. It's like another layer that adds to the actual physical wall. And I actually saw these towers recently. They're these sort of, you know, racial purity towers that use the same surveillance technology that is used to maintain the apartheid wall in Palestine. And so we have that technology at the border, and that has actually, in a weird way, like formed this relationship between Palestine solidarity and Mexico, you know, and Mexican Americans near the border and sort of, you know, Latinos in this country who are, you know, working to stop border militarization. And so there's this solidarity that's forming where they're actually joining forces to, like, you know, boycott Elbit Systems, right? And they're joining forces to combat border militarization. And that's really important. That kind of solidarity is so important. And I see it also with Ferguson. The Ferguson uprising has really, like, I guess, reinvigorated this Black Palestine solidarity that's always existed. It's just sort of been a little dormant for a while, but now it's like back in its and it's kind of incredible. And we see there, you know, this movement against police brutality in this country and against racism in this country is really incorporating Palestine into its language. Recently, there was this panel discussion that was going to happen that actually it was about Mexico, Palestine, and Ferguson. It was taking place in Missouri, in St. Louis, at a museum there. That's like known as sort of this progressive museum that you know routinely hosts talks on Ferguson. And the museum, 2 days before the talk, canceled it because Palestine was involved. They said either remove the Palestinians from the panel and remove it as a topic, or like find a different location. And so they were like, okay, I guess we're just going to find a different location. And it just brought these people closer together. But I mean, I think that's, as much as that sucks that this was canceled because, you know, Palestine was involved, I think it shows that there's this solidarity building, these bonds are building that are becoming unbreakable. And I think that's actually, you know, one of the most powerful ways to combat what's happening in Israel. In a lot of ways it's happening here is when you have the oppressed joining forces, especially since, you know, the oppressors are working together. So that's my take.
Yeah.
Sure. First of all, the academic side of it. I know Columbia has been bashed tonight by our panel. I mean, the School of Journalism has been bashed and other faculties, but I will still say that our department, MISAS, is we are trained. I mean, trained in a way that there are courses on Palestine that train you in finding sources up to the details of not only, I mean, historical sources, but also political sources, the kind of sources that you as a Palestinian would need. So within like when you're trained, I am trained to do my PhD, and so I need to refer to every single source that I find. And in that, we are also shown the many databases and the many archives are available for Palestinians to just, you know, find their works from. But this is from an academic point of view. So whether you're referring to pre-mandate Palestine or British mandate or post-Nakba or recent years. So this is the very academic work. There are databases, there are archives, and I could share them with you if you would like that. But then when I write an article, when you write an article and you have the writing starts, like when I write, I will talk about my personal experience. I wrote a piece for Al Jazeera about IDF recruits that serve in the Gaza Strip or serve in the West Bank, and they're Europeans and Americans. So they are just boys from Brooklyn and other places in Europe and Amsterdam and London that left last year and go serve and kill Palestinians where they have double citizenship. The way that I encountered that story was simply by the fact that one time at a checkpoint, I run into a kid from Amsterdam who spoke Dutch, and because I studied in Amsterdam and I spoke Dutch, she somehow related to me. And I was like, this is twisted to the level 2000. Like, you know, I mean, she's standing there, she's 19 years old with her uniform, I'm a Palestinian, and then she saw when going through my wallet, she saw my university pass, which was from Amsterdam, and then she spoke to me in Dutch. And she said, "Oh, are you from Amsterdam?" I said, "No, I'm from Utrecht, which is another city." She's like, "Oh, me too." I'm like, "No, you're not." Or you are. I don't know what you're doing, but I don't want to talk to you. That's first. That story. How is that a source? That's not, you know, I mean, that's my narrative of what happened, but that made me write a piece about foreign soldiers in Palestine. And when I needed to write about it, I had to go back, because I'm a Palestinian and I'm less objective than another Zionist writer. It is the truth.
Alex?
They ask for
You
sources.
want to add anything to that?
I can only give a very basic mainstream journalistic perspective. Sourcing is important. We really can't use much information that isn't sourced, but if you're the source of information, if a story happened to you, that's a perfectly acceptable source.
If I may add something into the question of sourcing, you may not know Ahmad Chalabi. Ahmad Chalabi played Miss Butler, who was in the Judith, what was her name? From New York Times. Miller. Like a broken violin during the so-called evidence of weapons of mass destruction with New York Times. And New York Times went with it, and that became instrumental in the build-up towards the Iraq War. And then she was discredited and went and wrote a book and retired. So that's one thing, that one should not fetishize that journalism, mainline journalism, doesn't actually manufacture sources. The second is there are multiple narratives. Scholars have certain narrative, but so do poets. The story that Hanin was just telling, I think, is far more compelling as a fiction, as a poem, as a drama, than actually talking about, you know, in a journalistic language. So this is what I said at the beginning, that Palestinians have not been waiting for New York Times to acknowledge their suffering. They have been telling multiple narratives, and legitimacy is with multiple narratives, not just one, scholarly, journalistic, or otherwise. Questions, please, sir. Anybody wants?
I don't know that you're.
Yeah,
Well, BBC is awful. It's like on a par with Fox News when it comes to Palestine. Al Jazeera is pretty good when it comes to Palestine. Any others in particular? Don't follow them.
Okay, I'll just share my experience. I lived a while in Europe. What happens in Europe is that the mainstream media in Europe has a task, and that is basically, but it starts from a very, like in Europe, the system is as such that Europeans feel incredibly guilty for what happened during the Holocaust, and they should. I mean, it's a crime, it's a genocide. That what happened during that time is just something that is being mentioned in the curriculum of schools from grade 1 up to there. And so the mainstream media is being, educated in that way that you cannot criticize the state of Israel because of what we have done. And so the mainstream media follows, just as in the United States, the government line. So right now, the Europeans, you will see also how the media plays in Europe. The European governments are trying to pressure Israel. And by doing that, they say, if you do not accept a two-state solution, we will boycott the products from the settlements. Because the governments are taking that line, you will find that the mainstream media is also taking that line. But just as people are struggling in the States with media, they are also in Europe as much. I know from the Netherlands, from Germany, the mainstream media is something, and then you have alternative medias.
Yeah, it was pretty remarkable the amount of media coverage that Netanyahu's statement and then his walk back, if you want to call it that, in terms of the two-state solution got. And I think for the first time, sort of in recent years at least, it was a clarifying moment for me, for many others, and perhaps for people in mainstream media. And I think many of the mainstream journalists who cover Israel-Palestine dislike Netanyahu, are not really big fans of right-wing Zionism. But this misses a larger context. I mean, the focus on this Netanyahu statement before the election misses that Netanyahu's whole career has been devoted to railing against Palestinians and preventing a Palestinian state in favor of a greater Israel where Israeli Jews dominate Palestinians in perpetuity. Netanyahu is never going to agree to a Palestinian state. He's going to continue to consolidate the system that is in place right now. It also ignores the actual campaign statements of the so-called Zionist left in Israel, the Zionist Union, which is a partnership of the Labor Party, Isaac Herzog, and Tzipi Livni of Hatnua. Tzipi Livni was a high-ranking official during Operation Cast Lead when 1,400 Palestinians, a vast majority of them civilians, were killed in Gaza. She said, Israel exhibited real hooliganism in Gaza, and that's a good thing. So you had Tzipi Livni and Isaac Herzog being kind of representing the liberal face of Israel. And the fact is that if you look at the platform of the Zionist Union, it was very similar to Netanyahu in terms of his vision of a Palestinian state as he outlined in a 2009 speech at Bar Ilan University. Demilitarize Palestine, meaning Palestine would not have an army. The annexation of the settlement blocks, which would basically make Palestine a sort of disconnected islands in a sea of settlements, as Amir Haas has said. And so, on the one hand, the Netanyahu statement, you're going to get a lot of coverage of sort of his statements going forward and what his rule means for a Palestinian state. On the other hand, you're missing the entire context of sort of Zionism and what Zionism means, whether you're on the Zionist left or if you're a right-wing Zionist.
I would add to that, on what you're saying. The media, like you said, doesn't like Netanyahu and is also, especially I guess what you could call the liberal media. I don't know if you could call it that, but liberal journalists, liberal opinion makers, liberal pundits are losing it. Like, they're freaking out because they are obsessed with this idea of two states. Why? Well, all these same people who are coming out and saying, Netanyahu, what he said was outrageous. Oh my goodness, it's so racist. Are the same people who who are basically saying, oh my God, we need two states, or else, the world's going to end and Israel won't be a Jewish state, and, it's going to be overrun by too many Palestinians. I mean, they're essentially warning about too many Arab voters, too many Palestinian voters in a possible future one state. That's why they're so obsessed with this idea of two states, even though it's like a unicorn at this point. I mean, there will never be two states. Like, that time has passed. I personally don't even agree with that. I think that segregation, which is what that is, segregation and separation, isn't, a road to justice. But regardless, what we see right now is we see, especially J Street just had its conference. J Street, like the lobbying, the liberal, side of Zionism, just had its conference, and the entire conference, the first thing that they said was, J Street is going to be at the forefront of the movement against BDS. The reason that liberal Zionists are against BDS, again, is because, it's kind of calling for equality for everybody, and for Palestinians to return, and that would, again, upend the Jewish majority, which liberal Zionists are committed to. So they're committed to maintaining somewhat of a racist state. It's just smaller. So really, there's the debate between right-wing and liberal Zionists is like, it's just more of a matter of like, how many Palestinians are we going to kill? How many Palestinians are we going to eliminate? How many Palestinians are allowed to be, in this area of land? But on top of that, I do just want to add that another thing I've been seeing in the media right now is around this language of two states is this really, this return of the demographic threat kind of language. And recently it came in the form of a warning about Palestinian fertility rates from Dana Milbank, a opinion writer for the Washington Post. He actually wrote an article where he said, he talked about his daughter and how he had to, he had to sort of convert his daughter to Judaism. It's a very elaborate
like
process. Just in case. This man is like a very privileged white man in America. Has a very privileged career. And he's saying he needs to, convert his daughter so that just in case the Gestapo comes to America, I think he said, she needs a spare state. In the same article, he talks, against one state, and we need a two-state solution because Palestinians have a higher fertility rate than Jews in Israel.
Okay. During the July operation, in fact, some of the best source of news coverage about what was happening in terms of opposition within Israel, demonstration against the war, was coming from Haaretz, was coming from people like Amira Hassan, Gideon Levy, and so forth. And on the other side, on the Egyptian side, Egyptian journalists were cheering so one has to be, as I said, spread up the thing. Yes, BBC has that policy, but Guardian is also there with a slightly different. One, in my opinion, should not look for one source that 100% corroborates one's political position. That's epistemically, politically, ideologically false. One has to learn to go to varieties of sources, including Israeli sources. The best, in fact, sources about some of the things that you never see them in a U.S. media actually come out in Jerusalem Post or Haaretz, sort of liberal Zionists. But by calling them liberal Zionists, one should not sort of put a blinder in terms of having a more sculpted view of what is happening in the region. Next question. Please, sir.
I think that there's a fear around criticizing Israel, unfortunately, that remains, especially among, I don't know if your colleagues are white, and I'm not saying this is all white people or only white people, but there is this like white Christian guilt around Israel, around Jews because of the Holocaust. And so I think that plays into it. There's also an understanding. People aren't stupid. Criticizing Israel is bad for your career. There's a reason that we're not writing for the New York Times. So I think that those two, are major, major factors. And there's also the progressive except for Palestine, right? That's an unfortunate reality that still exists. I think there's a lot of reasons for that I don't want to ramble on about. So if you guys have anything else to add.
I think this is changing somewhat, but I do think that there's probably still a fear of being stigmatized in terms of mainstream journalist circles. If your goal is to land a spot at the Times or MSNBC, why would you focus on Israel? I mean, in terms of if this is your focus of your career, you want to have a spot in the mainstream media world at this moment, focusing on Israel, criticizing Israel, analyzing Israel from a critical lens, it's not going to get you there, unfortunately. I think that's the reality. I do think that this is changing, at least on the opinion side. I mean, when you had Yousef Munayyer, who's now the executive director of the U.S. campaign to end the occupation, had pieces in MSNBC and a piece in the New York Times, which as Professor Tabashi said basically mentioned Israel's apartheid policies, and apparently nobody blinked an eye there. So I think there's this separation between opinion and kind of news analysis and news reporting that we see, and perhaps soon that kind of shift in the opinion section will bleed over into the mainstream. It just hasn't happened yet.
And I know we're supposed to keep the focus on media, but I also think it's worth mentioning this question is not something that's unique to media. I mean, you'll find a much wider range of opinion on Ferguson than Israel in the United States Congress as well. Israel simply has many more supporters who are very hard at work policing the bounds of what can be acceptably said, not in polite company perhaps, but in elite company, which is what we're talking about in various forms.
I haven't written quite about like the queer Palestine solidarity. Unfortunately, like that's just not my area of expertise. There are people who have, and they've done a wonderful job. But I will say this, that I agree with everything you just said. And I do think that there is this problem, and it's not just with queer issues, it's with like women. It's like kind of the same thing where like God, look at these Middle Eastern countries, they're so sexist, look how they treat their women. Israel's like this beacon of light where women, fly F-16s in Israel. But I think that would, what I find, really important to point out to people that raise this argument, at least for me, is that people who are oppressed are not virtuous, no matter who they are. And I'm not saying that it's true what is said about what Palestinians do to like queers, right? What I'm saying is that, whether it's black people in the United States, they're not perfect, right? It's like whether we're talking about Latinos and border militarization and, deportation, like the Latino community isn't perfect. No community that's being oppressed is perfect. And I don't think it's fair to use, the vices in their communities against them or as justification to ignore their plight or, to decide that all of them, are, they're unworthy, right? They're unworthy and they're deserving of the violence being inflicted upon them.
Underground activism?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I think that those two, they work sort of in conjunction together, especially the advocacy journalism that I think that we're involved in. But I absolutely think that the place where it's happening is like what you said, is on the ground. And the activism, the pushing of the envelope, that's all you guys, for sure.
Yeah, and sort of the relationship, I think that's a great point. I mean, like Mondoweiss or the Electronic Intifada or Democracy Now!, they, a lot of, in terms of from my experience as a writer for Mondoweiss, a lot of the stories that we do cover in terms of the U.S. is about this activism. So there is this mutual relationship where, I think activists who are doing this work, they want folks like Mondoweiss to cover, and Mondoweiss, as a news outlet that is focused on changing the terms of conversation about Israel and Palestine in this country, that we do want to focus on the activism that is going on college campuses like Columbia and so on. And so, I think that's also a substantive difference between mainstream journalism and alternative journalism, is that a focus of a lot of my work has been on the BDS movement and its growth and its challenges and so on. And so there is this very deep sort of intertwined relationship between the two.
Sure. I can talk about the Ask Hamas hashtag, and even the second one, what actually happens is what I was talking about, how the narrative is created from within Palestine. So there's a censorship imposed on the leadership of Hamas from Western governments. I believe that it's a terrorist for Palestinians to resist. And so let's say the leadership of Hamas has decided to talk and to break that embargo they're under siege. They're not allowed into the United States. They're not allowed into the UN. They're not allowed into Europe. They're not allowed to exit the Gaza Strip. But there's the internet where they can have a conversation either with Europeans, Americans, but also with Palestinians that cannot reach them. And so this online campaign was launched after the leadership of Hamas has sat together and decided to answer questions in English for the period of 5 days. And in the beginning, and that was really, really important, is that first of all, it was a successful campaign and it was done in a smart way. And the reason why I can say that now in retrospect is that the first 2 days, it was completely bashed by mainstream media. All the way they were online, the amount of internet trolls and the amount of actually articles that have been written to say, well, this is a complete failure. I think the Washington Post also wrote about it, like this is an entire failure. But then when you see online that, well, the people are really eager to hear from Hamas. People in the United States, Venezuela, even Arabs who were actually at the end of the campaign saying, why don't you do the same thing in Arabic? We also have questions. And so what Hamas did is that during 5 days, they brought 5 of their core people, starting from a female MP and going through a Palestinian prisoner that spent 20 years in Israeli jails. The third day was actually the former Palestinian Prime Minister Ismail Haniyeh, and the big surprise would have been actually Abu Ubaidah, which is the head of the Palestinian resistance military movement, someone who is on the #1 death list of Israel. And even this person would have answered questions, but for security reasons, he couldn't. So this campaign is something that really broke the siege. And then you saw after 6 days of campaigning online that mainstream media was like, well, it was successful, but we cannot say it was successful. But they did take, when the former prime minister answered questions, these were relevant political questions. As in, what is the stake of Hamas regarding this? What is the stake of Hamas regarding its relationship with Egypt? What is the stake of Hamas regarding military? You know, really questions that touch upon the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And what he answered was actually used in mainstream media. Whether to be used against him or in favor of him, that's another issue. But then you see how it became an interview, and it's not a formal interview. But I did show him answering the questions. So for journalists, that was reason enough to believe that it was actually the prime minister answering questions. So, and even I was one of the people when I got an answer, you know, you're like, oh yeah. Oh yeah, Ismail Haniyeh just tweeted at me. That kind of, and even in the Gaza Strip, even though it was meant for Western audience, Palestinians, Gazans were actually happy that we could interact because these people, we cannot access them through security reasons. So it really, like, these small initiatives have success.
I want to add one thing real
Please,
quick
please.
about the hashtag stuff. There are times when, yeah, like, you know, the media loves viral hashtags, and sometimes it can work if you do it smart. And there was one time where me and a colleague of mine actually, like, you know, it was around the time when Netanyahu kept constantly comparing Hamas to ISIS. Like, Hamas is ISIS, I think, was like the campaign of whatever they were making these cartoons of. And so Max Blumenthal and I started the hashtag JSOL, which was the Jewish state of Israel and the Levant. You know, Israel has proclaimed itself the Jewish state, right? It's in the Levant. And, you know, and we were kind of just making the comparisons. Like, it's striking how JSOL and its sister organization ISIL, you know, do similar things. For example, they both behead people. JSOL does it with drones. ISIL does it with daggers, but they both do it. They're both ethnically cleansing. Neither has internationally recognized borders. I mean, you know what I'm saying? And the media, like, sort of like, I mean, some of the media, we got like some pushback where they didn't like it. Like the New Yorker was really mad and thought it was stupid. I mean, that was the criticism. It's stupid. It was kind of childish, but still, it did get a lot of attention, and it kind of had people talking. And at one point, the Israeli, I think the Israeli consulate or something in the UK got mad because like an Amnesty International staffer tweeted something about Israel's human rights violations with the hashtag JSOL. And they put out a press release really upset about it. But anyways, I think there is some power in the hashtags. I mean, I don't think we should rely on it for like changing anything big, but I do think it offers an opportunity to change the narrative like we did in that respect.
Please, Joe.
Yes, my own perspective on things like hashtag campaigns, Twitter storms, thunderclaps, and if you don't know what I'm talking about, I wouldn't worry about it too much. But I think they can be a useful way to bring other activists' attention to something you feel is important. They can be, at best, a mobilizing tool. They're not mobilization. So it's an important distinction to maintain, my personal perspective.
Also solidarity. I mean, and that's really important. I think during the war, the solidarity that we get from a hashtag is something really, I mean, it might sound very trivial and very insignificant if someone would show his solidarity to you here in this campus by using, you know, Students for Justice for Palestine. But during wars, when you use a hashtag and you show your support, we know the hashtag like hashtag Gaza under attack. And then we kind of see that people, like, sometimes I used to see in my timelines, like, people using this hashtag in languages I could not understand, like Chinese and Vietnamese and Hindi and name it, like, really languages I could not understand. The only thing I could understand was actually the hashtag Gaza under attack. And that solidarity from humans all over the globe who just like literally tell you, I wish I could do something for you. I wish I could stand by you. I hate this. I wish I could, you know, spare you, save you, whatever. It means something at that moment. I mean, it's just a phone, and I know whenever my phone dies and I have no electricity, it's the end of it. But it just tells me that, you know what, there are people who care. There are people, Americans, despite that, yes, these drones come from America or these weapons come from America, there are Americans who are fighting this. And solidarity happens through a hashtag. And the people in the Gaza Strip have actually been able to do lots of, like the hashtag on the journalists is a hashtag for buying cameras and equipment like a bulletproof vest for Palestinian journalists in the Gaza Strip who cannot have them, not because there's no money. Well, first of all, because there's a financial, you know, sanction on Palestinians, but also because the borders are closed and these things cannot come in. And so Gazan is saying, well, can you help us? Can you help us do this? This is the hashtag, this is the link. If you can help us, support us. And it works, and this is people's way of showing solidarity. So there is, you know, and there is some kind of movement within the internet that people are seeing that. Of course, at the same time, as I said, you need to be, you know, to speak English to understand it, but I can read it. I tell it to, let's say, my aunt, and I tell it to my dad, and I tell it to my uncles, and they're like, really? I'm like, oh yeah, they care. And for people who, like my grandma, I would go and I would, who doesn't speak English, who thinks that the Gaza Strip isn't part of Palestine because she's from Jaffa. So it's a different, which is in the north of Palestine, it's occupied. And you go and tell her there's this thing, it's called hashtag, and it's Gaza under attack, and the people in America love you. And, you know, and it does something to people.
So all sorted Arab-Israeli conflict sorted out?
Yes.
Okay, then let me thank Doha and her. Colleague for organizing this gathering, thanking our distinguished panelists for graciously sharing their experiencing, thanking all of you, thanking the officer for keeping us happy, safe, and productive. And